Robert Hayes was known as a quiet Florida mechanic, but his daughter Anika would uncover a secret so explosive that it ended in blood, betrayal, and a murder that shocked the entire community. Robert Hayes was the kind of man most people barely noticed. He lived in a small Florida suburb, surrounded by neat lawns and quiet streets where everyone minded their own business. To the neighbors, he was the polite mechanic who waved on his way to work and fixed cars without ever overcharging. People respected him, but they didn't know much about him. He kept to himself, rarely attended community events, and never allowed anyone to get too close. His house looked ordinary from the outside: fresh paint, trimmed hedges, a tidy porch. But behind those walls, his life was far more complicated than anyone imagined. Robert shared his home with his daughter, Anika, who had moved in only a few months earlier. She was 23, born and raised in India, and had come to the United States after her mother's sudden death. Robert had insisted she stay with him, perhaps out of guilt for years spent apart. He wanted to provide stability, but their relationship was awkward. They were strangers bound by blood, learning how to coexist under the same roof. Anika was intelligent and observant. She noticed things most people would dismiss: the way her father left the house late at night, always making excuses about work emergencies; the way his phone would buzz with messages he never explained; the way he guarded his laptop with a caution that seemed unnecessary for a man who had nothing to hide. She didn't question him directly, but each small detail planted seeds of suspicion. At first, she tried to brush it off. She told herself that he had his routines, his responsibilities, and that she had no right to pry. But the thought of her father's secretive behavior gnawed at her mind. The more she paid attention, the more inconsistencies she noticed: missing hours, unexplained receipts tucked into his pockets, and credit card charges from places he never mentioned. The home itself carried an uncomfortable silence. They shared meals in near quiet, exchanging only small remarks about weather or errands. Anika longed for the closeness she had once imagined between father and daughter, but she felt a distance, like he was hiding behind a mask. Every time she looked at him, she wondered who he really was. To outsiders, Robert Hayes was just another man living a quiet life in Florida. But to Anika, he was becoming a puzzle she couldn't solve, a man wrapped in secrets that waited like shadows, ready to step into the light. It was only a matter of time before curiosity pushed her to uncover the truth, a truth darker and more complicated than she could ever prepare for. Anika's curiosity eventually outweighed her hesitation. One evening, while her father was out, she sat at his desk, staring at the glowing screen of his laptop. He had left it unlocked in his rush to leave, and temptation pulled her in. At first, she only expected to find bills, maybe work-related notes, but instead, she stumbled upon a folder of emails that changed everything she thought she knew about him. The messages were not casual exchanges; they were intimate, filled with affection and longing. The name at the top of each conversation was Lila. As Anika scrolled, her hands trembled. Lila was not just a friend. The emails spoke of love, promises, and plans for the future. Photographs were attached: smiling selfies, pictures at coffee shops, and moments of quiet togetherness. Lila was striking, confident, and unapologetically herself. Within a few minutes, Anika pieced together a relationship that had been going on for years, hidden in plain sight while she lived her own life across the ocean. The most startling discovery came when Anika read Lila's public blog posts linked in the emails. She learned that Lila was a transgender woman, a figure well known in local activist circles for her strength and advocacy. For many, Lila was an inspiration, someone who had fought for her identity and won. But for Anika, who had been raised in a deeply conservative environment, the revelation felt like a shockwave. She had never imagined her father could be involved in such a relationship, let alone keep it hidden all this time. The more she read, the more betrayed she felt. The words of devotion in those emails were words she had never heard from her father, not even when comforting her after her mother's death. The secret life he had created with Lila seemed warm and passionate, while his connection to Anika felt cold and distant. Questions flooded her mind. Had her mother known? Had their marriage been a facade? Was her father ashamed? Or was he simply unwilling to tell her the truth? The evidence became undeniable. The late-night outings, the credit card charges at unfamiliar hotels, the unexplained absences, they all connected back to Lila. Anika closed the laptop, but the words lingered in her head like whispers she couldn't silence. She now carried knowledge she wished she had never uncovered. What began as mild suspicion had exploded into a discovery that shattered her perception of her father completely. From that night on, she could no longer see him as the man she thought she knew. The discovery of her father's secret began to consume Anika's every waking moment. She could not stop replaying the words she had read, the photographs she had seen, the life her father had carefully built without ever letting her glimpse it. What started as shock soon turned into obsession. She checked his laptop again and again, reading the same messages until she knew them by heart. She followed Lila's online presence, scrolling through pictures, events, and posts that painted a picture of a life filled with confidence and pride. The more she looked, the more she compared it to her own existence, quiet, restrained, and overshadowed by her grief for her mother. Anika's thoughts began to darken. She no longer saw her father as a man simply protecting his privacy, but as someone who had betrayed the memory of the woman they had both lost. Every memory of her mother now felt poisoned. In her mind, Robert had been living two lives, one as a husband and father, the other as a man hiding with Lila. The idea became unbearable. What had once been curiosity turned into resentment, and that resentment festered into something heavier each passing day. The house grew colder. She began avoiding her father, retreating into her room whenever he was near. Yet she never stopped watching. She tracked his routines, noting the nights he left and the hours he returned. She saved screenshots of conversations and receipts, as if she were building a case against him. The silence between them stretched until even the simplest exchange, just asking about groceries or meals, felt tense and filled with unspoken anger. Anika's resentment was not only rooted in the relationship itself, but in what it represented. To her, it was a disruption of everything she had been taught to believe about family, loyalty, and honor. Each day she stared at her father across the dinner table, and each day she saw not a man trying to reconnect with his daughter, but a liar who had lived in shadows for years. She began imagining how to end the torment. She played out scenarios in her mind, some small, some violent, always circling back to the same thought. She could not let him continue living this life. The rage grew quietly, hidden beneath her calm exterior, while inside, the storm was already spiraling out of control. What had started as a secret she uncovered had now transformed into a burden she could no longer carry. The night that would change everything began like any other. The Florida air was heavy with humidity, clinging to the walls of the Hayes home as darkness settled over the neighborhood. Robert returned later than usual, his footsteps uneven as he walked through the front door. His shirt was slightly wrinkled, and there was a faint scent of perfume clinging to him. For Anika, watching silently from the hallway, it was confirmation of everything she already knew. Each detail was proof, each trace of another life feeding the fury she had been carrying for weeks. Robert moved about the house as if nothing were wrong. He dropped his keys on the counter, opened a beer, and settled into the couch with the television humming in the background. His comfort, his ease, enraged Anika more than anything else. How could he sit there, relaxed, while living a life filled with lies? She stood in the kitchen doorway, her heart pounding so loudly it felt like the sound filled the room. The thoughts she had rehearsed over and over suddenly became an impulse she could not hold back. Her eyes fell on the heavy iron skillet resting on the counter, still unwashed from breakfast. She picked it up, the weight solid and cold in her hands. For a moment she hesitated, staring at her father's back, the man who had raised her but who now seemed like a stranger. But hesitation quickly gave way to rage. In a single violent motion, she swung. The skillet connected with the back of his head with a sickening crack, and Robert collapsed forward without a sound. The television continued to flicker in the silence, as if nothing extraordinary had happened. Anika stood frozen, the skillet slipping from her trembling hands onto the tile floor. She stared at her father's motionless body, unable to believe what she had done. Minutes felt like hours as she tried to catch her breath, but the reality could not be undone. Panic surged through her as she dragged his body toward the garage, struggling under the weight, her arms aching with every movement. She wrapped him in an old bedsheet, the fabric quickly stained, and pushed him into the shadows. She sat for hours in the dark, staring at the door that separated her from the garage. The silence was unbearable, but it was nothing compared to the realization that there was no way back. In one impulsive act of rage, she had silenced the only family she had left. The house, once filled with uneasy secrets, now held something far heavier: death itself. The morning after the killing, Anika moved through the house in a daze. The air felt different, heavier, as if the walls themselves knew what she had done. She avoided looking toward the garage, but the thought of her father's body lying there gnawed at her mind. She scrubbed the kitchen floor, wiped down counters, and tried to erase any trace of the night before. No amount of cleaning could silence the pounding in her chest. By noon, the phone rang. It was one of Robert's co-workers, asking why he hadn't shown up for work. Anika mumbled an excuse about him being sick, her voice shaking, but the man on the other end sounded unconvinced. Within a day, police were knocking at the door. They had been alerted after Robert failed to answer multiple calls. Anika opened the door with a forced smile, but her nervousness betrayed her. Officers asked routine questions, but her stammered answers raised red flags. When they asked to look around, she froze. The tension in her silence spoke louder than any words. They obtained a warrant, and within hours the garage door was pried open. Inside, wrapped in a blood-stained sheet, lay Robert's body. The interrogation that followed was brief. Faced with evidence and unable to hold her composure, Anika confessed. She told them about the emails, the photographs, and the relationship that had consumed her thoughts. To investigators, it became clear that this was not a random act of violence, but a crime rooted in rage and misunderstanding. Yet what shocked them most was the discovery in Robert's desk drawer, a sealed envelope addressed to Anika. Inside was a letter written in his careful handwriting. In it, Robert explained that he had planned to introduce Lila to his daughter the following week. He wrote of his love for Lila, of the years of secrecy, and of his hope that Anika could one day accept the truth. He spoke about rebuilding trust, about wanting to be honest, about never meaning to hide forever. The words painted a picture of a man trying to bridge two worlds, not deceive them. The community was shaken when the story spread. Headlines branded it a tragic case of family betrayal, a daughter killing her father not for money or revenge, but for a truth she could not bear. Robert's life ended before he could reveal his secret openly, and Anika's life was destroyed by the weight of her own anger. In the end, silence and secrecy had claimed them both, leaving only questions and grief behind.